Good evening, everyone. Good to have you here tonight. So first thing I'd just like to say, why don't we go back to the past, or maybe welcome to the future.
Have you ever had the feeling that you knew what someone was going to say just before he said it? Or have you ever walked into a strange room and had the sensation that you'd been there before? Well, if you have, you've taken a small step beyond. Now watch a giant step.
That was actually John Newland. He was a writer and a director from the 1950s, and he created a show called One Step Beyond. I had never heard of it before a few months ago, and Valerie and I discovered it. And two really interesting characteristics about this television show. First off, it beat Twilight Zone out of the box by about 6 months. And also, secondly, and more importantly, as opposed to the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits and all of those science fiction knockoffs, One Step Beyond purported to be true, that all of these psychic and occult and parapsychological phenomena were gathered around the world by John Newland and his staff. All stories purported to be true. Out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, time expansion, time travel, all the kinds of things that people watched and said, really? Could that be possible? And it lasted for 3 years. And the only reason it went off the air, because they had backing by Alcoa Aluminum. They ran out of stories. But check it out. One Step Beyond, it's on Tubi, T-U-B-I, and they found it in a vault somewhere, and some of the film is, not in great shape. But I think it's perfect because it tells us that this has been part of the American story for an awful long time. So again, welcome to all of you tonight. And I just want to ask a question. What are these folks doing behind me up on the wall? I'm going to speak about that in just a moment. But first, let's check into where we've been over the last 5 years. Okay, so take your personal lives, put them on the side burner for just a moment, whatever your job or your relationships or your money or career, whatever. Let's just take stock, okay? COVID, vaccines, kids murdered in schools, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, 2 impeachments, insurrection at the Capitol, George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, riots, Joe Biden. I could go on and on, right? Sometimes we don't really want to take stock of that because it's all too much. And yet at the same time, we realize that perhaps these things are here for a reason. Now, every person who's going to be joining me over the next 4 weeks, and I have 6 really exceptional speakers and guests who are going to be joining us, only one by pre-tape. I'll talk about that in a moment. But everyone to a person would tell you that these existential crises are in our lives for a reason, that there's a silver lining behind it. In fact, some of our speakers would say, not only is it important, it's actually necessary for our evolution. Chew on that for a moment. Now, last year, some of you were at the One Mind series. Some of you watching were part of it. A little bit of a review, and if you weren't at the One Mind series last year, here's what it was all about. Are we on the verge of a new Copernican revolution? What does that mean? Are we seeing mind and consciousness and how we interrelate with one another dramatically different? Now, many years ago, 500 years ago, Copernicus, that's the Copernican revolution, Copernicus came along and he said, the Catholic Church may not be right about this. The Catholic Church said, the earth is in the center of the universe, and if you sat out on your porch or in your farm field, you see the sun and the moon and the stars go overhead, and you would think, well, it's self-evident. We're at the center of the universe. Everything is revolving around us. Kind of sounds like the ego. Everything revolves around me. And that's what the church thought. But Copernicus was an astronomer, and he started thinking, this is not the case. We are revolving around the sun. So the church got word of some of this, and they said, why don't you come on down to Rome and explain some of your theorems? And he said, I'm still working on it, just sharing it with scholars. He was smart. He finally publishes his book on the day he dies. Good timing there, Mr. Copernicus. The other gentleman in the picture, Giordano Bruno, lower left-hand corner, was not nearly as shrewd but was far more courageous, because 70 years later, after Copernicus, he's doing the same work. And he says, you know what? Not only does the sun, does the Earth and all the other planets revolve around the sun, we're in a solar system and the sun is at the solar system. We're not even in the center, not only not in the center of our solar system, we're not even in the center of the universe either. And so they said, would you like to recant? And he says, I think you're more scared of me than I am of you. And they end up hanging him and then burning him at the stake. And then another 70 years later, Galileo comes along and he doubles down, triples down on it. He says, wait a minute, not only do all these planets revolve around the sun, but there's more than one solar system. We're not even the only solar system. And he, too, is invited to Rome. Would you like to reconsider your theory? And Galileo looks at the racks and metal bits and says, maybe I'll change my mind on this one. And so they put Galileo in house arrest for the rest of his life. Now, Galileo really tried. He told the clerics, no, come on, look in the telescope. I can prove it to you that the planets revolve around the sun. But that consciousness was so ensconced, the church was so invested in the notion that the earth was at the center of the universe, they could not let in anything else. And science, to some degree, has been the same way with consciousness over the last 100 years. So it started with this. The brain creates consciousness. Come on, everybody knows it creates consciousness. It's self-evident, right? Okay? We've mapped the brain. We can see all of the workings within the brain. We know that it has to be created here. And once this goes, everything's gone. Once we have bodily death, say goodbye. Consciousness is no more because the brain creates it. But in the last 100 years or so, slowly but surely, and again, the mystics and the authors and the speakers and the philosophers seem to get there first. I think of Aldous Huxley, who said, the mind is not the brain. The brain is a filtering agent. The mind is expansive. It's not relegated to time and space. It's not limited to your cranium. It's elsewhere produced. And we're filtering it here through this system. And over the last 50 or 60 years, despite science's pushback, we've heard from people at the University of Cornell University, Darrell Bem, and the folks up at University of Virginia. We had them at our One Mind course last year. And University of Arizona and J.B. Ryan Institute at Duke, the Global Consciousness Project at Princeton, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. We'll be talking to Dr. Wahbeh later tonight, who have all saying this. Once we reach the conclusion or reach the notion or are open to the notion that consciousness is everywhere present, that we are interconnected in consciousness, now things such as near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, reincarnation, the life review, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and all of the other psi phenomena, parapsychological, paranormal, whatever you would like to say, is in play. The brain does not create consciousness. Let me read this quote from Albert Einstein, because in some ways I'm really flustered by the fact that neuroscientists and quantum physicists have been talking about this for such a long time, but mainstream science has said, no, we're not going to look in the telescope. Listen to what Einstein said. Now, he didn't call it the one mind, but I think it defines it. A human being is a part of a whole we call the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. Think about that. What he was actually saying 60, 70, 80 years ago. And yet science has been pushing it back against this notion. He called it an optical delusion, not an optical illusion, an optical delusion of consciousness. And today, science is clearly beginning to look into the telescope. You'll meet one of those people tonight. Now, again, why are these 5 people staring at me? Well, here's why. These 5 folks, and I could have put up 20, but here are 5, were all revolutionaries in consciousness, in thought, in action, in contemplation. And all of them demonstrated this frontier edge of consciousness in times of great conflict and chaos. We think we're living in existential times today. Albert Einstein was chased out of Germany. He was a Jew in Germany. Good thing, too, because he got a meeting with President Roosevelt and said, we better get on this atomic program, otherwise the Nazis are going to get the bomb first. The Dalai Lama, long line of lamas throughout hundreds, maybe thousands of years. The communist Chinese come in, kick him out, put somebody else in his place. And he's always maintained his equanimity. And of course, we know the stories of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, how they and their people were pilloried, beaten, killed, etc. Martin Luther King, his home was firebombed, and of course, eventually he dies. I believe they tapped into a consciousness that was not only not based on the present or the past, it's almost like they threw a grappling hook out to the future, to some place outside time and space, because they truly were revolutionaries right at the very tip, at the very frontiers of consciousness. They brought in something completely new. They were revolutionaries, never picked up the gun. Now, let's take a look or listen to another revolutionary. It's a face you all recognize, Mr. John Lennon. And of course, John Lennon was a very, very complex man. He had a lot of different beliefs over his lifetime, which in some ways may be the hallmark of great minds. They're willing to change their minds. They're actually willing to evolve. And in 1967, John and Ringo and George and Paul all head off to India. And they're there to meditate with the Maharishi. This is a great cultural event. This is East meeting West, and not in a Gandhi versus the British sense. It's not a collision so much, it's a conversion, a convergence of consciousness. And while Lennon and the Beatles are meditating in the hills of India, what's going on around in the world? Protests in the United States against Vietnam, violent. The Chinese Cultural Revolution, still raging in China. London has riots that year. Paris comes this close to their next revolution. So what does John do? Well, he sits up in the hills of India and he writes the song Revolution. Now there's a pop quiz here, so you all better be ready to participate, okay? So John writes the song Revolution, and you know, he was conflicted because he wanted to see humanity move forward. He just didn't know how. So he he writes Revolution in India, and he writes a version which is eventually going to show up on the Beatles' eponymous album, The Beatles, otherwise known as the White Album. And it goes something like this. You guys should remember this. You say you want a revolution. Well, you know, we all want to change the world. But if you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me? Count me out. Anybody say anything different? Okay, you get half credit. That's it. All right. And here's the reason why. Half credit. Paula gets half credit. I was banking on Richard because, you know, Richard's our music director here at Unity Renaissance Spiritual Center. I thought he was a Beatles fan as well. But here's what Lennon actually did. When he wrote the words, originally, the first version, which goes on the White Album, is a bluesy version. And he writes, don't you know that you can count me out in? He says out and in. He was conflicted. Lennon was conflicted. He wasn't sure about how to participate in revolution. But he thought about it, and he thought about it. And when they got back to England, they recorded the version that you all have running as a tape loop in your brain. That was a version that became a single later on. It's on the flip side of Hey Jude, but it became a hit in its own right. And by that time, John Lennon said, nope, it's a pacifist approach. And that's when he wrote, if you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out? Now, many years later, in 1998, Yoko Ono was interviewed. This is long after John dies. John dies in 1980. And she gave her thoughts on Lennon's approach to revolution. And she said, John's idea was that there was too much repercussion in the usual form of revolution. He preferred evolution. So you have to take a peaceful method to get peace rather than you don't care what method you take to get peace. And he was very, very adamant about that. In truth, he was writing about a revolution of the mind rather than a physical in-the-streets revolution. He truly believed that revolution comes from interchange rather than social violence. And you know, this is the guy who wrote Imagine. And a lot of people thought he was a hard left revolutionary, that he was an atheist. After all, when you listen to the words of of Lenin in Imagine. It's like, imagine there's no heaven, no hell below us, above us only sky. Yet once again, John Lennon reserved the right to change his mind. And I have 3 quotes here, and I've got to read them to you because I really think it gives you insight into a great revolutionary. Here's what he said in the late 60s. There are 2 basic motivating forces, fear and love. When we are afraid, we pull back from life. When we're in love, we open to all that life has to offer with passion, excitement, and acceptance. Evolution and all hopes for a better world rest in the fearlessness and open-hearted vision of people who embrace life. Wow, John Lennon. Almost sounds like a student of the Course in Miracles, right? He didn't say love and hate. Course in Miracles, the linchpin of the Course in Miracles is it's either love or fear. Here's what he said in a 1969 interview. We're all God. Christ said the kingdom of heaven is within you. And the Indians say that, and the Zen people say that, and the Buddhists say that. We're all God. Now, I'm not a God or even the God. Sounds a little bit like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, right? I'm not the God. But we're all God, and we're all potentially divine and potentially evil. We all have everything within us, and the kingdom of heaven is nigh and within us, and if you look hard enough, you'll see it. John Lennon in 1969. And finally, for those who still hold on, no, he was an atheist, no hell below us, no above us only sky, no heaven, no religion, blah, blah, blah. Here's the last interview, 3 days before he passes. But still, the concept of imagining no countries, imagining no religion, not imagining no God, although you're entitled to do that too, Imagine no denominations. Imagining that we revere Jesus Christ, Muhammad, Krishna, Malenapi equally. We don't have to worship either one, that we don't have to, but imagine there's no Catholic/Protestant. There's no Jew/Christian. That we allow it all. Freedom of religion, for real. Just imagine it. Would it be so terrible? So what kind of a revolutionary was John Lennon after all? So last time when we were here, last fall, during the One Mind series, I said, everybody's had an experience. Or they know of someone who's had a psi experience or psi phenomenon. And that is also true of John Lennon. And it's also true in the context of his son Julian. Now, hold on 1 second, guys. I didn't move my pictures along here. But here is a picture of Julian Lennon. So here's the story. Julian Lennon, 15 years or so, maybe 20 years after John dies, he's touring Australia. He had a few hits in his own right. You may remember he had a couple of hits and a few pop albums. He's touring Australia. And he's up in his room, and he gets a call, and they said, Mr. Lennon, there are some 50 people down here in the lobby with cameras and lights, and they would like to talk with you. And Julian thought it was his crew and his band just mocking him and playing on him. It wasn't. He went down. There were folks from the Mirning tribe here in Western Australia. They were an Aboriginal tribe. They had had their water rights cut. They had had some of their land rights stolen from them. There were other things that were happening to them as an Aboriginal natives of the land of Australia. And they approached Julian Lennon, the leader, the chief, said, you have a voice. Can you help us? And he pulls out a huge white feather. Well, Julian blanches, turns white, starts to tremble. 1 year before John Lennon had passed away, he was having a discussion with his son, Julian. And he said, if one day I should just pop off out of here and leave prematurely, I'm going to come back. If you want to know that you're going to be all right, that all of us were going to be all right, I'm going to show up with a white feather. And Julian Lennon was shaking at that point. And at that moment, he decided right then and there he was going to start this organization, the White Feather Foundation, which was to help Aboriginal and Native tribes all around the world, conservation efforts, also helping youth, many other things. He created an Emmy Award, or actually just a worldwide award-winning documentary on the Mirning tribe. Everyone has a story, even the John and Julian Lennons of the world. We all have stories. The connection I want to make with you over the next 4 weeks is this. set your intention, because you are creating the content as well. Your intention is going to help it be what it's going to be. Now, I know for some people that may sound like a throwaway line, but clearly I believe that your intention and your being here will help create and draw things out that never would have come out. Alan Cohen, author of 32 best-selling books. He's been an inspirational teacher for over 30 years. He actually appeared here at Unity Renaissance Spiritual Life Center many years ago, some 20 years ago. His latest book is The Mystical Messiah. It is the metaphysical interpretations of the life and the readings and the sayings of Jesus. Last year he put out a great book called Friends in High Places. Here's my 19-minute interview with Mr. Cohen. So Alan, thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate having you here. I'm hoping next time we'll have a chance to have you live and in person, at least by Zoom, so people can pick your brain as well. But I have that honor of doing that today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your metaphysical research and the journeys that you've taken and intersperse that where we are as a nation. And 6 years ago, after Donald Trump won the election in 2016, there are some people overjoyed and some people who are horrified. And I think you helped calm a bunch of folks down when you sent out, I think you sent out 10 pointers about why this election could end up being something very positive. And so I think you told people, look, it's not the end of the world, and it's not the second coming of Jesus either. Thanks but in some ways, it seems that ever since you sent out those 10 pointers, and I've shared those with my class already, that we still seem to be in more or less the same place. So if you can synopsize this for us, where do you think we are as a nation on a soul level right now?
I think the events of the last 6 years at least have given everybody a chance to decide where you stand in consciousness. And it was the same thing with COVID, actually, that when a Trump election or COVID comes around that's disturbing to many people, everybody gets to choose between fear and love. And you know, I'm a teacher and student of A Course in Miracles. And the Course says that every thought, feeling, word, and action stems from either fear or love. There's no in between. So what happens when something big and scary comes up is some people revert to extreme fear and even paranoia. They get defensive, they get argumentative, they get aggressive. And other people say, hey, here's a chance to practice loving and trusting and supporting and recognizing there's a bigger universe than appearances indicate. And of course, the people who go into fear go into great pain, and the people who go into fear go into great flow, great aliveness. And the ones who are fully alive end up making the great contribution. People with fear will have to come around and face that same decision at a later date.
I think we'd have to admit, though, and you do bring up COVID as well, between COVID and the election, in some ways, they were, let's say, put it this way, more existential crises than we'd probably faced in some time, maybe politically in over 100 years.
Yeah. And thank God. It's like, you know, we bitch and moan about them, but the truth is they're tremendous spiritual learning opportunities. And, you know, if you're a student of consciousness of any kind, you recognize that everything that shows up is no accident, a potential lesson for healing. So that people who know how to work their tools say, wow, big energy, big challenge, big opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, you know, a lot of people take COVID, for example, use that time as a chance to go within and meditate and pray, connect with their families and be creative and hold the high vision and help each other. So it's really a call for angels to come forth and do our inner work, and, you know, brings us closer to spirit instead of alienates us from it.
And you would think about it too, about the crises around the world that we're facing, such as, you know, authoritarianism, not only at home, but really in many countries, climate change, and there are others. I guess if we're really going to get our act together on this planet, we really it's almost warranted that some of these great challenges are coming our way. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you know, a martial arts master takes the energy coming at him or her and redirects it. And so, you know, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And so when we can use this stuff in our favor, we accelerate and grow far more quickly than if things have been cushy and easy. So yeah, it's hard, but yeah, the opportunity is immense.
Let me give you a quote here from Marianne Williamson and just comment on it. She said that she quotes Thomas Paine, of course, at the time of the American Revolution, that said, "These are times that try men's and women's souls." And she says, if there was ever a time to stand for something bigger than ourselves, it's now. We need a season of repair, an era of new beginnings, and a commitment of fundamental change. This will have to include inner as well as outer changes, in the words of Martin Luther King, quantitative shifts in our circumstances, as well as qualitative changes in our souls.
Yeah, right on. Go Marianne. And she was quoting Thomas Paine, did you say at the beginning? Was that it?
Yeah, the first quote was, these are times that try men's souls. And of course, that was at the time of the revolution, where he said the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. And maybe, maybe this is part of my critique that I've had of the so-called New Age, New Thought movement over the last 150 years, is that after the 20th century, and New Thought came out of the 20th century, it kind of split in two, where you had maybe a new age bend in the road, where people were into self-improvement, self-reflection, meditation, etc. But maybe they were using their metaphysics to build a better life, a better relationship, a bigger car, a bigger home. Others continue to be socially active. I'm thinking of the Unitarian Universalists and the Black churches. Isn't this also a time of not only going inward, but if we don't take it outward, if we're not pragmatic mystics and exercising that in the world, what good is it?
Yeah, there's the old parable of the yogi who sat for 20 or 30 years in meditation in the Himalayas in a cave, and he attained deep inner peace and enlightenment. And then he walked into town and somebody bumped into him and he punched him. So the question is, how deep was that peace? And it's easy to be peaceful in a cave, unless you have a rat chewing at your loincloth, which is another story. But it's harder to do the principles in public, in relationship, in community. And so, yeah, you build bigger muscles when Course in Miracles says that relationship is the fastest and most powerful way to God. It says healing our worldly relationships provide us with the greatest opportunities for healing, far more than retreat type spiritual practices. So right on, we have to learn to live the stuff rather than just talk about it. If you're not living it, you don't know it.
Yeah, and again, part of the theme that we're talking about is you say you want a revolution in consciousness. And of course, many years ago, let's go back to the 60s, people were like, yeah, let's get up, let's revolt, let's march. They were kind of angry. And you see one of the people over my shoulder here, where Mother Teresa was asked to go to an anti-war rally, and she goes, no, I'm not coming. If you've got a pro-peace rally, I'll show up to that. So I guess in some ways, I'm still very big on social activism. I think that the likes of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, again behind me, took a rarefied consciousness and they exercised it in the world. And again, my critique of New Age sometimes is, go within, that's great, but what are you going to do? Especially when it's possible that democracy and our republic are at stake.
Well, Ram Dass used to say that, what's the use of marching for peace if you're sending out a set of vibrations that are causing war?
Yeah.
So if you're angry and victimized and polarized and you hate your opponents, Martin Luther King was not against white people. He was for civil rights for everybody. And Gandhi did not hate the British. He just wanted to free the Indians. So it's like the people who create the most effective social change somehow find a way to hold peace and well-being and all embraciveness in their hearts, even while they're opposing somebody politically.
There you go. Let me make a little bit of a shift here. I was really captivated by, 2 or 3 of your books, really actually in the last year, but let's delve into Friends in High Places. You had a book and you had a series. Tell us a little bit about that
and maybe why that's so important with what we're going through in our nation and in the world right now.
I've been on the spiritual path for many years, and I've been helped by higher sources than human beings. And I've encountered a number of people who were channelers and mediums who were really, really tapped into source. And I've seen a lot of phonies and frauds and wannabes, and you know, it's very important to discern between quality and ego. But there are beings who are non-physical, who are sending messages and healing and love and support to the people of the earth. And I think it's, you know, we have to be open to embrace that level of communication and consciousness in order to make sense of our earthly journey. One of my teachers said, you know, when you just work on the physical plane alone, it's like being in two dimensions. But when you embrace the spiritual aspect, it's like you're rising in a helicopter and you get to see the whole picture instead of just, you know, the two dimensions. So that book was really important because it really acknowledges and celebrates the fact that we all have help from a higher source, whether it's our angels or spirit guides or gurus or masters or descended or ascended masters or relatives who's gone on. So gosh, you know, I can't imagine where I'd be without it. My life has been enhanced so beautifully by non-physical sources. And I just want to come out of the closet and say, this is real. Mm-hmm. This works. You have access to it. Let's take advantage of it.
Yeah, it's time. I mean, Jeffrey Mishlove, who's going to be joining us later in this series, has said something to the effect that, you know, human evolution will never take that next step until it really comes to grips with the reality of consciousness surviving death, consciousness being non-local. Your take on that?
Well, people say I don't believe in invisible stuff, and meanwhile, your entire day in life is filled with invisible communications. You have a wireless router in your home, and the internet is beaming invisible packets of information from satellites, and people walk down the street in New York with a little thing in their ear and they're talking to somebody in Mumbai. They say, that invisible stuff, I don't get it. Well, our entire world now depends on invisible stuff. So are you going to accept it or not?
You know, you told a story once about Abraham, and Abraham, again, is a channeled source. And I think a lot of people in the audience, or a number, have heard of Abraham. And I think you asked him or them some questions and they gave you a great answer. And afterwards you said, thank you. And they said, no, thank you. We're all in this together. And I was walking along the boardwalk today, listening to that. And I said, I've got to raise this with Alan today because, you know, it kind of puts the psychic source, if you will, more or less on the same level as us. It doesn't create an us and them. Yeah. Also, I had to raise that this issue today because as I was listening to this, a woman walked by in a t-shirt that said, we're all in this together.
Oh, really? Cool. Good synchronicity.
you can't make this stuff up. I did look and say, well, today's the day. But there's some truth to that too, isn't there? Is that, you know.
Yeah. Well, that was a great teaching for me because we do tend to idolize and iconize spiritual masters and sources, and they do deserve reverence and honor, of course, but the really good ones teach us that we're equal to them in spirit. And here, I just saw my first copy of my new book today. Maybe it's backwards. It's Mystical Messiah.
You got it, yes.
Yeah. And, you know, Jesus did not want to set himself up as an icon, although most people have done that. And of course, he said, even greater things than I shall do. He said, don't call me rabbi, which means teacher. He says, you only have only one teacher, your Father in heaven. And in the Course in Miracles, he says, I am simply your elder brother who has walked a little farther down the path we're all walking, and I want to extend my hand to you to help me walk by my side. So as far as I can tell, Jesus is looking for peers more than worshipers. And I believe any good channeler or guru has to say the same thing, otherwise they're not worth their salt. That the best teachers want us to be equal, want us to recognize our spiritual equality with them and not make ourselves smaller than them. That's where we kind of miss the boat.
So Alan, to sum up in some ways, how will things that you write about and talk about, whether it's channeling, I mean, we've talked about near-death experiences, reincarnation, the life review, all of these things that are facets of the one mind. How is that going to help us in this time period? And how is it going to help us move through any challenges that we may be facing? And what might it lead to?
Well, it's really the only thing that'll help us, Christopher. You know, I talk about there's the storyline and the glory line. And the storyline is the facts of our lives and the methods we use, and kind of like the two-dimensional or the material plane kind of solutions. The glory line is really our connection, is vertical. So if you try to make lateral or horizontal changes, like, you know, going from one bad relationship to another, or quitting one job and getting another bad one, or, you know, having a health issue and then another one pops up. Those are all lateral, horizontal, or storyline changes. The only changes that really work are the glory line changes, or the vertical changes, in which we elevate consciousness and move from a higher position. So, you know, problems on the earth are nothing new. You know, Jesus said that in the world shall have tribulation, troubles, but be of good cheer, for I've overcome the world. What he's saying is that the polarized world is about suffering and death and disparities and wars and politics. He said there's another way to look at all of this, which I have discovered. And if you would like to join me in my perspective, you too will rise above the tribulations of the world. So I think the world is what it is, but I think what we make of it is through the consciousness that we observe it from. We have to put on another lens in order to see how to proceed more clearly, more effectively.
So since you are a student and a teacher of the Course in Miracles, I have to suspect you're an optimist.
I prefer to think of myself as a realist. I think Anwar Sadat said, "I don't believe in miracles, I depend on them." And I think he also said, "You're not a realist unless you believe in miracles." So, yeah, Course in Miracles says that a happy outcome to all things is sure.
Right.
And that's pretty darn optimistic. And so I like to believe that for every problem there's a solution, for every pain there's a healing, for every death there's a life. And so, yeah, you might call me optimistic, but I don't think there's really an alternative. I mean, someone said, if you don't believe in optimism, try pessimism and see how well that works. So I just think there's a way to think that works. And when you step into that way to think, then your life starts to work.
Let me leave you with a quote here again from Marianne Williamson. Maybe we get one more comment from you. She says, you know, everywhere I go in the world, people ask me, what's going on in America? I understand how people in other countries would be looking at the United States right now and asking how we've gone so berserk. But I've told people that what they see on the news is not an accurate picture of who we are. Right now, we're simply going through a very difficult chapter. I remind them of the vast majority of Americans are good and decent people, just like in other countries. And while we're in the middle of some very unfortunate events, we'll make it through, so don't count us out.
Yeah, I think that human beings are basically good because we're all connected to spirit. Now, that goodness often gets eclipsed by fear and illusion. But when it comes down to it, what was that Starman, wonderful movie Starman, where an alien comes to Earth and he falls in love with this woman, they visit and all that. And he says, one thing he's about to go back to his planet. He says, one thing I discovered about people is that when things are at their worst, you get to be at your best. So we have the propensity to go way down, but we also have the propensity to go way up. And I prefer to put my chips on the part of us that knows how to go way up. And that's the only salvation of humanity, to stay connected to our God source and live from it. That's all I can see.
Alan, once again, it's always a pleasure being with you. Always a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks so much. We'll catch up later.
And you're doing great work too. I want to honor you, Christopher. Thanks for all you're doing as well.
I appreciate it.
Well, we've got Helane here, so let's just go ahead and proceed. Good evening, Helane. Can you hear me?
It's wonderful to be here with you today. Thanks so much for inviting me to be in this conversation, an important conversation for sure.
It really is. And thank you for being here. And again, just a little bit about, we didn't even really get a chance to officially introduce Dr. Helane Wahbeh, but she is the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS. She's an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University. She is clinically trained as a naturopathic physician. The Science of Channeling is her most recent book, and recent articles on where science and spirituality meet, and more recent on collective consciousness and our sense of interconnectedness, also authored by her. Dr. Wahbeh, thank you for joining us tonight. First, just a little bit, I had a picture, which we didn't get a chance to put up there, a picture of the Earth from outer space. And I think for those of us old enough to remember, maybe not you, but all those old enough to remember that picture of the Earth from outer space, this was taken as the astronauts returned from the moon. And Edgar Mitchell, the man who actually started the Institute of Noetic Sciences, I don't think maybe not everyone knows this. He was the sixth man to walk on the moon, and he has an epiphany on the way back from the moon, does he not?
He does. He had this amazing experience. He's trained as an engineer and became an astronaut, went to the moon, which is incredible in and of itself, did his job on the moon. And then as he was coming home, he was in his capsule and the capsule was spinning and he would see the sun, the stars, the earth. And he had this incredible transcendent experience where he felt completely at one with everything and that everything was one with him as well. Now, as an engineer, this was completely foreign to him, this experience that was so visceral. And he came back to Earth and said, I want to know what that is all about, and started the Institute of Noetic Sciences 50 years later. I can't believe it's been 50 years this next year. We have been studying the science of interconnectedness, how we are all connected, and more recently about consciousness and how our consciousness is non-local and is part of this interconnectedness as well.
We tackled this last fall when we were talking about the one mind and all the fruits of the one mind, and how, and of course we worked with Doctors Tucker and Grayson from the University of Virginia, which is just in our backyard, more or less. And they're talking about non-local consciousness. I've got to think that even though there's lots of pushback, and I want you to tell one or two stories from your book, but I've got to think that this is narrowing that now really serious scientific researchers, maybe not the John Olivers of the world, and maybe some of the other pundits or the amazing Randings, although he's passed on. But I have to think the serious scientists are looking at this seriously.
I believe they are, this concept of non-local consciousness. So in the past, we've been in this paradigm, what you might call materialism. So everything that exists is material, is a physical substance, substrate, and everything that is not physical is essentially impossible. So these experiences that so many people have that go outside of those physical boundaries are either a hallucination or fraud or some other explanation. So now there's many scientists from many different disciplines, physics, cosmology, philosophers are looking at this concept of post-materialism, which includes non-local consciousness. So what does that mean exactly? Traditionally, in a materialistic worldview, our consciousness is limited to our physical brain. Our neurons create our consciousness, and that's where they're housed and that's where they stay. In a post-materialist worldview, our consciousness extends beyond our physical brain, extends beyond time, beyond space, and has the capacity to access, perceive, receive information from beyond just our physical body. So this really does open the door. It has extended beyond the spiritual into the scientific, where we are gaining more evidence that this may in fact have some validity.
How many years have you been with IONS now?
7 years.
Okay, so a mere 7 years ago, I think you're seated at a dinner with others, and you tell them that you're going to go ahead and serve at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and someone said, you know, this can hurt your career.
Yes, in fact, the statement was much more severe than that. They said, you know, this is going to kill your academic career, right? And I was taken aback because it was such a dramatic statement. And I took a deep breath and I said, well, if that's so, that's okay, because I'm really not willing to continue doing the research that omits such a huge part of what I believe is at play in our human experience.
Now, you wrote the book Against the Science of Channeling, great book. And I recommend people pick it up. But when you talk about channeling, you know, we think about channeling, and again, Edgar Cayce was just in our backyard many years ago, but we're right next to Virginia Beach. So Cayce does have some presence here. When I think of channelers, I think of a medium or someone elevated like a Mr. Cayce who is tapping into the Akashic records or his highest self, etc. Your use of the word channeling, at least in your book, seems to be a catch-all for any of the, what we would call psi phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, intuition, mediumship, etc. Is that accurate?
Yes, you just gave a beautiful description. So I do use a broader umbrella term definition for channeling that does include all of those. And so I'm proposing that all humans have the capacity to channel in one way or another, and that the way it shows up for them is unique. And the way it shows up is on this spectrum, from things like gut hunches or intuitive hits that just about anyone could say that they've experienced at some part in their life, to things like mediumship or trance channeling, which is a term many people associate with the word channeling. So trance channeling is a subcategory of this broader umbrella term that I'm calling channeling.
But you come by channeling honestly as well, because both your grandmother and your mother were channels, correct?
That's right. That's right. They were
And
both trance channels.
And wasn't there an incident once where after your grandmother had passed on, your mother channeled your grandmother and she divulged or shared information that only you and your grandma knew?
Yes, it's really quite an interesting story. My grandmother was in the hospital and I was having a private conversation with her, and she was expressing her concern about passing on, because while she loved my grandfather in life, her religious belief was that she was going to be married to him for eternity. And she wasn't that excited about passing on to be married to him for eternity. So this was a fear that was blocking her from leaving her body. So I, was as loving and kind as I could be as she was sharing that and just trying to nurture and support her. So later, after she did pass, it was probably a few months later, my mother, I believe, channeled my grandmother, and she started laughing and laughing and said, I was totally wrong. I don't have to be married to him for eternity. I see him here or there, but he's doing his thing and I'm doing mine.
So there you go. So there's a practical application of channeling. There you go. Not just what I should eat today or what I'm going to be doing in my next lifetime or what have you. But again, what's kind of interesting is now you work for IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences, and you folks take a very rigorous science approach to this phenomenon. In fact, I think you're the director of research, not just overall, but when it comes to channeling, don't you do the research regarding that as well?
Yes, so I'm the director of research of our wonderful multidisciplinary team. And I had most of the channeling studies because it is in my personal expertise, personal interest, and scientific background.
Right. So and again, we'll get on to some of the other things that IONS does, but I've got to drill down just a little bit, because even though we feel hopeful that science is at least entertaining this, again, science doesn't have to prove that channeling is dispositive tomorrow. It's demonstrably true. We know it as a scientific fact. Just the fact that they're open to it as a phenomenon. And apparently didn't IONS submit 2 papers for peer review, which were really, you folks put so much work into it, and you wanted to have them perform peer review, these 2 esteemed journals. And apparently they said channeling does not occur, neither do pigs fly. Tell us about that.
So you know, I talked about these paradigms, the materialist and the post-materialist. We really have one foot in both. And so it's this incredible transition where we're running against so many obstacles. Now, the gold standard in science and academia is to submit your work to what's called a peer review. And then your peers review it, they give you constructive criticism, improve it, etc. So when we submitted this to a journal, it was actually a very benign study. That one was on meditators, and it was asking meditators if they had any channeling type experiences during channeling or around their channeling practice. And many of them said yes, like telepathic experiences with their teachers, seeing non-physical beings around them, etc. But the topic was pretty benign. And the editor wrote this like 2-page vehement, angry email saying, not only am I rejecting this, but I'm going to actively work on preventing any study like this from ever being published. And your research question is not one that you should even be asking, because these are impossible. It's a waste of time, money, etc. It's like running a study to see if pigs could fly. It was very, very incredible. So my understanding is that science is actually a verb. It is a process. It's a very methodical, structured process to answer research questions. There is no limit to the research questions that you can be curious about. And so we were incredibly surprised by this response. It's definitely given a food for these conversations about taboos and obstacles and fear about these phenomenon that so many people experience.
Well, it's one thing to reject your research. It's another thing, like the clerics in the time of Galileo, to not even want to look into the telescope. It sounds
That's
like
right.
look into the telescope. So,
And you can oh, sorry.
No, go
And
ahead.
you can even go further, because if someone's worldview is so entrenched, even when they look in the telescope, they can't see. It's like they literally block themselves from seeing what's right in front of them. There was some story about the Wright brothers when the airplane, you know, they were learning how to create the airplane, and people they literally couldn't see it because it just did not fit within their worldview.
Yeah, didn't some scientists come out and say this is why this could, in other words, the Wright brothers had already flown, but then there was a lot of fake news that said, no, that never happened because scientifically it's impossible.
Right, right. And it's like, oh, but there it goes. So how do you explain that? The
Yeah.
models are obviously incomplete.
Right, there you go. Well, let's talk just about a few of I really want to talk about the interconnectedness and the collective consciousness. I'm going to get to that, but there are so many studies that you and Dean Radin and others at IONS have been performing that really are mind-blowing. We talked about the mind-blowing nature of life, death, and consciousness here at this Unity Spiritual Life Center. But let's talk about a couple, some of your favorite. I mean, I could go into some of the RNGs or some of the precognitives. What are some of the more favorite ones that demonstrate the fruits of this one mind that we talk about?
There's so many to choose from. I'll start with one that I really love. It's called, it's a protocol called the Distant Mental Intention of Living Systems. So imagine that, or DMILS for short. Imagine that you and your friend, you're really close, you decide to participate in this study. You go to the laboratory and you sit in a room in front of a closed caption TV monitor. Your friend goes across the building into a different room. Both of you are hooked up to electrodes that collect your brain waves, your heart waves, what's happening with your skin, etc. And then you are instructed to, every time you see your friend's face on the monitor, to send them positive intentions. And when their picture goes away, you stop. And you repeat that cycle over and over again. So then we gather all of the physiological data from both of you and look at how that shifts from when you're sending intention to when you're not. And there is a dramatic difference. And your the your friend's physiology changes when you're sending compared to when you're not. Even
At that
though
exact moment.
at that exact moment, even though they're separated, different part of the building, electromagnetically shielded chambers, et cetera, et cetera. To me, that is absolutely incredible. And that's been repeated in multiple labs all over the world. The body is an amazing, amazing vehicle.
Truly it is. And the random number generators work that you folks have done, and I think some in conjunction with the Global Consciousness Project. I mean, we've talked about it here, and I think you folks know the story, but very briefly, the random number generators, actually, Helena, why don't you please tell folks what the random number generators are? You can tell them better than I can, and why it's so important and how we've conducted experiments around the world. Then we'll get to 9/11. But go ahead.
So they're random number generators. Let's call it a target. It is a target that has been used for decades of our intention, our mental intention being directed against this target. Parapsychology researchers have been trying different targets over the years. And this idea of having random probabilistic systems as a target increased a few decades ago. And so these random number generators are essentially electronic devices that generate, just to put it simply, zeros and ones in equal amount. So 50-50, zeros and ones, and it happens totally randomly. And for the most part, there's nothing that can make those deviate. So after you look at this whole length of data, there should always be an equal number of zeros and ones. Mm-hmm. Now, there have been numerous studies that have been done in the laboratory where people direct their intention towards these devices and the data shifts, either more ones or more zeros. And there's not a really good explanation for this, in my opinion, besides that our intention has some effect. Now, there's so many nuances and lots of theories about how this works exactly, but we've demonstrated that effect over and over and over again. Now, that protocol I just described in the lab, random number generator, one person directing, is very different from the Global Consciousness Project. Mm-hmm. Now, and the reason it's different is because in the laboratory, the person sitting there knows that they are specifically, intentfully directing their intention towards this thing. The Global Consciousness Project has multiple random number generators all over the globe, and it's just constantly collecting data. And perhaps some of us who know about it may be directing our attention to it, but for the most part, we're just going about living our lives. Mm-hmm. And the Global Consciousness devices collected data for over 20 years and found very statistically significant effects when they looked at 500 different events. And there's so many lessons in that project that I think are quite fascinating.
These are generally galvanizing events like 9/11, like the death of Princess Diana, et cetera. So, rather than going into all the minute details of that, it really starts to demonstrate just how powerful our intention is. So we're talking about prayer for other people, or setting our intention before this course, asking you folks to set your intention as well. How valuable that is, and now how valuable that is in relationship to scientific proof.
Absolutely. I mean, we see over and over again that intention matters. One lesson from the Global Consciousness Project that I thought is quite fascinating is that the data was significant, whether it was a positive event or whether it was a negative event. So that polarity didn't really matter. It was this kind of emotional charge. But in other studies, we see how intention matters. Intending that chocolate makes you feel better, or tea makes you feel better, or intention on cells in vitro, or plants, or people, or animal models for healing, for learning. and learning, actually. There have been studies where people direct their intention to students, and those students do better on tests. So there's many studies that are showing these significant effects. Now, those effects are small. So they're in the 0.15 to 0.25 range, which is kind of on the smaller end. A behavioral intervention might be about 0.25, 0.3. So some people say, oh, well, they just write it off. And they say, well, the effect is so small. But we keep seeing it over and over and over again in many different labs around the world consistently. And we get to pool that data and see the strength of that evidence.
I just want to remind the folks here who are watching on Zoom tonight, if you would like to ask Dr. Wahbeh a question tonight, there is the microphone. Step up to it or raise your hand and move to it. But in a moment or two, we're going to take questions. And if you're in Zoom land, just raise your hand. There's a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Raise your hand and Valerie will do her best to get your question in here. And if we have any trouble getting it in there, you can even type it in the chat box and we'll relay that to Dr. Wahbeh. So here's a $64,000 question, Dr. Wahbeh, although that's not much money these days, right? Back in the 50s. But here it is. I mean, all of these things are titillating, they're interesting, they're fascinating. When we did the One Mind series last fall, it was like, wow, the universe is a lot broader. We're more interconnected than ever. What real effect does it have on our lives on a day-to-day basis, especially since we're living in a time with what some people call existential crises? We're looking at an intense midterm coming up. We got some problems in our country. There's concern about our republic. Sometimes we like to relegate our spirituality to one silo and our real life to another. And yet we're talking about the collective consciousness and interconnectivity, which is one of your specialties. So give us some insights and maybe some hope for the times that we're living in right now.
Absolutely. So channeling, like I mentioned, I feel is a capacity of all humans, and it allows us to tap into our intuitive noetic wisdom to really help us discern the next best steps for us in our own individual lives. There have been numerous studies showing that channeling is good for you, that people have increased meaning, increased quality of life, and receive benefits from the process of channeling. That's on an individual level. You take it one step further. Could we perhaps gain information that might support humanity with these intractable problems that we're facing that we as humans don't have access to, but perhaps tapping into a higher, wiser, and more empowered source might offer us solutions? So that's one aspect that I think it's really important to include channeling in the conversation. The second is about, you mentioned the interconnectedness. So if I really, truly embody this concept of interconnectedness, then my ability to hate, to demean, to ostracize, I feel becomes diminished. And the conversation becomes less about us and them, less blaming, less judging, less finding what's different, to more about what is our common ground. Maybe we actually all just want the same thing, and the way we're trying to get there looks very, very different. It invites us to see ourselves in the other and work more diligently to find solutions that can support the whole. Because you can't exclude the other. If we're all interconnected, you can't say, okay, I don't like what they're doing, I'm just going to put them over there, because you're intrinsically interconnected. You can fool yourself in thinking that they're over there, but they really aren't. So why not? I have another funny suggestion that would be really amazing if it happened someday. What if, whatever blocks us from truly experiencing this interconnection on a very real practical level just disappeared. What if tomorrow I woke up, I could hear everybody's thoughts, I could feel everybody's feelings? I feel that would be a trial by fire, but would really refine our impeccability with our thoughts, with our actions, with our deeds. If I knew what everyone was thinking around me, it would make it very clear what was going on, no lying. It would be completely transparent. And you'd have to clean up your act very, very quickly.
And well, maybe this is, we talk about, I think you'd have to agree that perhaps on the verge of a major shift in consciousness, maybe that's what it looks like.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that's happening naturally in not such an extreme way. But, since COVID and people being quarantined in their homes, et cetera, there was so much more introspective action and people just really wondering, who am I? What's my meaning in life? And being more interested in these topics. I actually just wrote a small editorial about how people are searching these topics out. IONS has increased their membership. Our webinars have thousands of people on them. Similar organizations are getting many more people interested in these topics.
We have a question from the audience. It's actually the Reverend Paula McDeasy.
Thank
Okay.
you so much for being with us this evening. It's just such an honor, and I love everything that you're sharing. So here's my question. You were talking before, I found that very fascinating to hear about how people who had a different mindset couldn't even see what was right in front of their eyes. So how do we get past this sense that there are some of us who really want to do this consciousness work, who perhaps are sending our intentions out into, to others, right? To create this field of unity and oneness. But then there are others who are very set in their ways or closed off. They're basically living in another reality and not open to that. How does that get sorted out? I mean, even in your case where you've had other scientists who, don't even, they're out to get you now because, you're on a different wavelength than them, literally. So I think that's where the frustration is, that in unity in particular, we talk about shifting our consciousness, but we're looking for some sense of hope that by shifting our consciousness, that actually will have impact on others who are very resistant to anything like that.
Yes, that's a beautiful question. And I deal with this all the time. And when I was first at IONS and I received, this really intense negative feedback, I felt impelled to just need to engage with them and talk to them and convince them, no, look at this, look at that, look at this, look at that. And I found very quickly that there's some people who are just completely closed. And I could, give them a pile of evidence to the ceiling and it wouldn't matter. And I personally made the choice to love them and let them go and say, great, when you're ready, I'm here and I'm happy to share. And I don't give them a whole lot of time or energy. And again, I talk about spectrums a lot, right? So here's the spectrum. Those people are extreme over here. And I just, love them and make resources available and don't worry about them. And then you have the people over here who are just completely on the bandwagon no matter what. And they really could care less about the science because they've had their direct experiences and they're on board. The people who are really our audience, who are my audience, are in the middle. They are, a little open, a little curious. They don't really know about the studies, but they're open to hearing about them. And honestly, that is a big part of the spectrum, that the extremes are there, and they're often really loud, that it seems like there's a lot of them, but there aren't. And I just don't spend my time or energy focusing on them. And I focus on this middle section. We just got a paper published in the Frontiers of Psychology, which is a mainstream journal, which we're thrilled about. And it was all about theories of consciousness. And we wrote that paper in a very specific way to just put a little wedge in the door, because we started with all the, materialistic theories. And then we said, well, what if, this other situation was happening? And we introduced the other theories, and it's had almost 16,000 views now. So for us, that is a huge, huge win. Huge win. And, we had a couple people email us and say, well, why didn't you talk about all of these more extreme psi phenomenon? And we said, we purposefully did this to just open the door, this little crack. And that's the work that I do every day.
That's a great strategy. Thank you so much. That gives me a lot of hope, the way you described that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Wahbeh. That's what we want. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for hope from the scientists as well. And I think you say that one of the hopeful signs is if more and more people come out and talk about channeling, not be so reticent to be out there and talking about what others have called woo-woo for so many decades.
Absolutely. I mean, the surveys show us over and over again that, between the lowest are about 30%, up to 90% of people who are polled. These are like huge studies with tens of thousands of people around the world are having these experiences, various experiences from, telepathy, precognition, precognitive dreams, lucid dreaming, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences. So many of these experiences people are having, but they're afraid to talk about them. And so I would have numerous people emailing me or coming up to me saying, thank you so much. I had this experience and I can't tell anyone about it. But if everyone's not telling anyone about it, they feel alone. They feel like they're unusual in the experiences they're having, and they're actually really not. It's actually incredibly, incredibly common.
This question is, and again, you folks have a chance to ask any question of Dr. Wahbeh that you'd like within reason. But here's one from me, and it's a bit of a loaded question. It's a bit of a Rorschach test. Answer it any way you'd like, Dr. Wahbeh. Is there a veil that's lifting? What is that veil?
Oh, that's a great question. So we can answer that in two ways. Is there a personal veil that we somehow, because of our ego personality, just like with the Wright brothers example, we aren't able to see our true magnificence? I think that that's likely true on some level. Is there some sort of broader veil over all of humanity that is blocking our ability to access this human capacity? I can't speak to that definitively. It feels intuitively, just this is Helane speaking, not scientist speaking, that there is, and that it is loosening, because I do see more and more people waking up, if you will, to their potential, waking up to this felt sense that they are more than what they believe themselves to be in the past, and that feels like it is accelerating.
Well, it's interesting, again, since we're in Edgar Cayce's backyard, and Pat Robertson for that matter. I have to bring the two up together because we love to span the spiritual spectrum here in the coastal Virginia area. But Cayce talked about in this century of humanity evolving into the fifth root race. And I'm not exact, and I've read the Cayce readings, not as much as some other folks have. I don't think anyone's come up with anything definitive, but it does talk about some sort of natural evolution of being able to tap into what we would call psychic powers, awareness powers, powers of expansion of consciousness that we're currently not tapping into. What of that?
Yes, this is a common theme amongst many channelers and mediums. We did a really fascinating study with 5 full trans-channel mediums in Mount Shasta, and we did a big qualitative analysis of the content that came through. And that was a very common theme, this awakening of humanity, this evolution from the third dimension into the fifth dimension. And you see, there's channeled content saying this similar thing all over the place. How do we test that? So, my personal spiritual self can perhaps meditate and feel into that. As a scientist, I wonder, well, how can I actually test that? Is there a way for us to measure that in some way?
So maybe this, the existential crises, or what we see as existential crises, perhaps this hyper divisiveness is here to teach us something? Question mark.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is a mirror. It is showing us our shadow. It is showing us the deep, dark muck that we need to own as part of ourselves. Everything that is reflected outside of ourselves is within us. Oh, sorry.
So a catalyst of sorts. This
Yeah,
divisiveness is a catalyst.
absolutely. And it is an opportunity for growth. So do I want to stay in victim tyrant mentality or us them mentality, or do I want to rise above that? There's a great visual that has inspired me and brought me hope. And if you envision a glass of water and the water appears very clear, but at the bottom of the glass is a bunch of mud. So, you don't want to drink that water, it has mud in it, but it looks clear on the top. So, and then you envision pouring in beautiful crystal clear water. Well, that's going to stir up the mud, and the water is going to look worse. It's going to look all murky and dark and disgusting. But if you keep pouring in that beautiful crystal clear water, eventually you'll have this lovely glass of water with no mud at the bottom. I think we are in the mucky mud right now, where the clear water may be poured in, but it just looks really ugly from the outside.
We have a couple of questions for you, one here in the room, and I know at least one coming by Zoom, but Barbara, go ahead.
Hello. Oh, there you go.
Okay, there it is. Done.
Okay. One of the things that I have always envisioned, I'm very much into Native American belief systems and stuff. And when they came up with the term World Wide Web in computers, what I visualized a web, and every place that the web intersects is a person. And every time a person does something wrong, it distorts the symmetry of the web and its perfection. And the other thing was I also coined a new term I thought would be good in the evolution of people. They call us Homo erectus. Well, I think in this sense, I think we should call ourselves Homo sionus, which is bringing about the idea that we are becoming more psychically endowed, and it's a form of survival. And we are starting to utilize those gifts that have been hidden inside of ourselves and bringing them out. And socially, I believe it's becoming more and more acceptable to be able to show these gifts that we have. I have Asperger's syndrome, and I find that in this case, this is what I use all the time. My psychic senses when I am creating, because I'm an artist and stuff, and I'm a storyteller. So I just wondered what your ideas about that would be.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think that the World Wide Web, the internet, has been a beautiful physical manifestation of this interconnectedness. And perhaps it has even supported humanity to feel in a very practical way our interconnectedness. I can sit at my computer and send an email and instantly being connected to someone in Africa, say. So it's broadened, I think, the modern human mind in a practical sense this interconnectedness. And I think you're not alone in envisioning a new name for what humanity is evolving into. And I really like that one. Thank you.
Dr. Wahbeh, we've got one more question for you, and then we'll let you go for the evening because you've been here with us longer than we had asked you to. So this is from John in New Jersey, a pragmatic, consequential question. He says, I agree with and accept the reality of universal consciousness. Star Wars introduced us to the idea of the Jedi mind control. In your opinion, is that an aspect of universal consciousness, and can it be used for good or bad?
That's a great question. And it always comes up if we all of a sudden became very psychic to the point where I could hear everybody's thoughts and I could also influence everyone's thoughts. There is a morality connected to that. There is an ethics in being impeccable with how we use those abilities. I don't have an answer for your question, really, but I think that it is incredibly important to think about. It's something that we talk about on our team all the time because some of our research is looking into the genetics of psychic ability. And I believe and propose that all humans can channel in some way, but perhaps the way that I channel has something to do with my genetics. I come down from a long line of trans channelers. Does that mean I can trans channel more easily, whereas someone else couldn't? So, and the ethics of that line of research is really important. So I don't have a clear answer for your question, but I think it is a very, very important one to ask and one that we have at the forefront of our mind and continue discussing.
Well, once again, Dr. Helane Wahbeh is the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Again, her book is The Science of Channeling. Love your recent articles on where science and spirituality meet, and also on the collective consciousness and our sense of interconnectedness. Dr. Wahbeh, I hope it's not the last time we get a chance to interact with you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate what you're here to do.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Have a great
Have a
evening.
good evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Wahbeh can be contacted through the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And if you'd like to donate to the Institute of Noetic Sciences, I really encourage you to do that. You know, it's interesting. She didn't get a chance to say this, but a lot of this research, you know, a lot of people who would like to donate to this kind of research can't even do it because it will pillory them, it will taint them. So sometimes getting money for this kind of work is very difficult. Next week, we have two great guests who are going to be joining us. Glenn Aparicio-Parry, he joined us for a book study earlier this year. He wrote a phenomenal book called Original Politics, Making America Sacred Again. And among other things, he takes a very spiritual look at politics in our nation and the evolution of politics. I think he might surprise you because he doesn't fall in one category or the other. And he talks about the indispensable dedication and inclusion of American spirit, Native American spirituality in the American soul. And we don't evolve and move forward until we fuse that back into our soul. It's one of those gaping holes in the American soul. And Mitch Horowitz is going to join us next week. And Mitch was here maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago. I can't remember. We miss him, but he is literally considered the leading voice of alternative spirituality in this country. He wrote a groundbreaking book called Occult America. His most recent one is Daydream Believer. He's great. I know Paula, Richard, we're going to see him again, even if it's by Zoom. That's okay. So we want to thank you for being here tonight. We just want to let you know we're here for you. Thanks for joining us by Zoom. Thanks for being right here in the audience. And let's let John Newland take us out.
Next week, and every week, we'll be bringing you the personal records of the rarest kind of human experience. Man's adventure in the world of the unknown, that mysterious psychic world beyond our 5 senses. This is your invitation to take with us that astonishing one step beyond.